Alright, so spontaneous review here. Today I'm actually reviewing a film called Spontaneous. I didn't announce it, but I gotta start announcing things. But I will be reviewing Love and Monsters this month, which is done by the same guy, Brian Duffield, a writer, director on this one. Is going to be doing that Love and Monsters one too. And this is a guy that did Netflix original, The Babysitter, and the sequel. He worked on that one. So this is a guy with horror comedy background, and I like me some horror comedy. So this one stars Katherine Langford and Charlie Plummer in Spontaneous, an explosive love story about growing up and blowing up. It's a coming-of-age love story about seniors that start to explode and just living life like every moment could be their last, because it damn well could be. With that said, though, the way I tend to review things, all the positives up front in Act 1 of my review, Act 2, my personal bias, if any things that may not necessarily affect your view of the film, but affect mine. And then Act 3, all the negatives, where they went wrong, the flaws, the holes, if any. We'll see. With that said, let's get to it. Spontaneous with Katherine Langford and Charlie Plummer having some amazing chemistry on screen. This film does a lot of things pretty damn well. From the opening scene where they quickly set up everything for the narrative moving forward, that they're just done so fast, done so well, while giving you our main character's perspective and kind of most of everybody else's perspective. That's going to be our main characters involved in moving this movie forward. They did a damn good job with comedy too. I mean, there's some stuff that really falls flat, and that's mostly in relation to the writer projecting his political affiliation on screen. But for the most part, because I think you should mostly just leave the politics out of something like this, where it's not about politics. But for the most part, like I was saying, there is a lot of great comedy in here, a lot of really, really good stuff, and it is a bit on the nose with the metaphor, but there is so much in here that is just so well executed, and it comes across just the way it should be, with the spontaneous love story, the deaths, all this. And while it isn't really really gruesome or anything like that, it is pretty brutal. And if you really think about it from like the parents' perspective, from the students' perspective, you know, your loved ones can die at any moment right in front of you, and they probably will, and in brutal fashion. There's a lot of things in here that I was thinking about as this movie was going on. Like, I thought it was interesting that they pointed out the little, you know, the little stick figure family things on the back of the car that you peel off, wondering what happens to those when somebody dies. I did wonder that, and when I saw them doing that, I was like, oh, that's interesting that they point that out. Also, another thing is, I was like, none of these guys should be driving, and then I was like, they better point that out in this movie, and they actually paid that off very well in this movie. So there's a lot of things that are really done well, especially the kind of cutesy rom-com romance thing they try to do. So if you're really into that, this one does that real good service. It is a great rom-com, more so than an actual horror movie. I bet it is pretty horrifying if you really think about it, like from the perspective of the characters, especially like the parents. Oh my god, my kid could die at any moment. But there's a lot of things that are pretty well done in here. And some of the things that are well done, though, could also have been better executed in other ways. And there's a lot to be desired still, but really great comedy. And the way these characters transition from normal life to just this downward spiral of intensity. You never know when it's going to happen. So that there's a kind of thriller element to there, with the fact that you never know when it's going to happen and to who, with all these kids exploding. But only the seniors, for some reason. There's a lot of questions never answered, and that's in relation unfortunately, to the exploding. I try not to get too much into spoilers and be vague while conveying the story to you. But the dynamics between the parents, the daughter, our main character and her parents, her and her boyfriend, her and her best friend. There's a lot of really good stuff there. Really strong relationships. Just so well executed. The chemistry between all these actors felt like it was authentic. Felt like it was great. And some of the stuff doesn't feel that convincing. There are some moments in the acting or with the jokes that just aren't that convincing, but there's a lot of stuff that's just pretty damn funny, and this was somewhat refreshing, and some people will be able to draw parallels between this movie and what's happening now with the whole pandemic and stuff. I didn't really feel that, but you probably certain people will probably be able to draw those parallels from what's going on in reality to what's going on in this movie. But not me. With that said, though, I gotta say, this very funny movie, great acting, very good on the love story side of things. So makes a great rom-com, makes a great comedy, makes a great horror. Well, I wouldn't say makes a great horror, but definitely makes an interesting horror movie. Though, with all this said, though, I want to go ahead and move into the next part of the review. Alright, so my personal bias on this one, the film can be politically divisive, but it doesn't go all the way. It doesn't have the balls to go all the way until the very end, where our main character makes an unnecessary jab at Trump through dialogue. The writer obviously leans one direction of political affiliation and risks alienating one side of the audience in small doses to project on screen. There are little comments here and there, so it's not too off-putting in small doses, but it will probably have some people not wanting to watch it again by the end of the film. And I just don't think that's the best way to do these kind of things. You can do them in movies and TV shows that are really political, that have a political purpose and drive, that are drenched in politics. Literally, the characters are political figures and stuff like that. But in this kind of film, you don't really want to do that. You don't really want to alienate one side of your audience, and I just think this is going to be off-putting for some people. I personally don't like politics in here like this. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but by the end, it does take a jab that I feel a lot of people aren't going to be cool with. Uh, Another thing I want to put in my personal bias section is, and it's going to go into the bad section too, is that the film does this really deep dive into the love story, so much so that it kind of feels like the other stuff becomes irrelevant. And I just couldn't personally really get into that, knowing this stuff, knowing that this is literally going to blow up in their faces. I don't know if that's just, I don't know if that's a failure in the execution of the story or a personal bias. So I'll just go ahead and put it in both areas. With that said, though, let's move on into the negatives of this. So the worst things about this film are the film has a lot of early talking to the screen, to the audience, that can start to really take you out of the reality, the immersion. It can make you resistant to embracing this story from the very opening. And the opening, I will say, is well executed because they quickly give you all this ensemble of scenes that really explain everything, our character's perspective, everything the kids are going through, are going to be going through. But it also kind of gives away the explosion of the first student before the first student really explodes, and in that manner it takes away the impact of just the silent hardcore reality that this just happened. It doesn't really give you much normalcy before it gets into that stuff, and that has a negative impact, in my opinion, on the execution. And while some of this on the screen, this directly talking to the audience moments works well, like I said, the opening scene, it was well executed to quickly get us involved in the story, give us our character's perspective, all that. But at the same time, some of the other stuff that comes up later, for instance, from the boy's perspective, the boyfriend's perspective, our boyfriend to be, his perspective, his stuff kind of drags on and it takes you a little out of it. So there's a lot of missed opportunity in this one, and a surprising lack of interest from the seniors when it comes to trying to find answers and the origins of what's causing this to happen. They'll criticize the government and the CDC, medical professionals and all that, without taking any effort or interest themselves, but they have no problem criticizing the government for its lack of providing answers. And that is in some way a negative, because that's them not really taking personal responsibility for that. But then again, they are teenagers. But I just felt like it wasn't that well handled in the story, especially in a kind of story where the writer obviously has left-leaning perspectives and projects them onto the screen and kind of criticizes, the one side of the political affiliation, but does these things where these characters aren't really taking responsibility for their illness. And like I said, I get that this film is supposed to be this like spontaneous, on the nose, very transparent metaphor for, life coming and going. The spontaneous explosion is just meant to be a metaphor for life, death, without rhyme or reason, how easy it all comes and goes, love, all that stuff. But a solid third act with answers, kids teaming up to investigate, would have paid off those ET references. And another thing is, it's very hard to get into the kind of, cutesy romance, deep dive stuff, because they really start to deeply dive into it, lean into it. It's really hard to get into that cutesy romance stuff when the whole time it's literally gonna blow up in their faces at some point. It's very obvious, and because of that, it's hard to fully embrace that aspect of the story, because you just know it's coming. You know it's going to happen. The only question is when it's going to happen. But spontaneous, spontaneous. So, I mean, while it is well handled in a lot of different areas and stuff, it does leave a lot to be desired, and it could have done without like political alienation to certain audience, so it would have a wider reach. And as I said, it doesn't go all the way until the very end, and that might, turn some people off from returning. But I do feel like the film could have really had a solid third act that gives answers, even though this movie didn't necessarily want to give answers, because the metaphor of, spontaneous, everything spontaneous, love, death, life, it can all be gone in an instant. You may not even see it coming. They did handle a lot well, but also they didn't give, for me, a solid, satisfactory third act that really brings this story full circle in any way, shape, or form. I didn't like how it ended. The fact that we never got answers, the fact that nobody on the kids' side really took interest in finding those answers. So there's a lot of negatives in there mixed in with positives, and a lot of the things that are positives can also be negatives, and just more on the nose about life. A lot of things in life are pretty positive. Bet some of those exact same things can be pretty negative. So when it comes down to it, my final score we'll just go ahead and get into my final score. So Spontaneous is a 6 out of 10 for me on the entertainment level. While that may be lower score than expected, there are several flaws. While the romantic comedy aspect of it is pretty great, but as deep as they go, as cutesy and all that as it gets, and as adorable as that can be, it's hard to get fully invested in it, knowing this is all going to blow up in their faces, quite literally. When it comes to the comedy of it, it is pretty hilarious slapstick, sometimes even laugh out loud. But the writer tends to project their political affiliation on screen, and with as far as they go in the end, it may hurt the appeal of repeat viewings for this one and be kind of divisive for the audience. That said, in the horror aspect, it's not anything that I think audiences would feel scared over, unless you immerse yourself in the reality of what these characters are dealing with. I don't think it's going to drum up much fear. It's much more of a comedy than a horror. So ultimately, for me, it has aspects that kind of work against each other with the overall quality of it. The execution, for the most part, is pretty well done, but it also fails to really give concrete answers as to what the characters are dealing with. It also fails to have them really take the interest themselves into figuring out why all this is going on, and audiences are kind of left hanging without it, even though I understand that it's supposed to be a kind of on-the-nose metaphor for about how easy things come and go, how quick things come and go, and how spontaneous life is. But for me, it results in a 6 out of 10 because while it's got great execution and it's got great on-screen chemistry between all these characters, all these actors, it just has a lot of things that kind of work against each other, and they don't really balance it well enough, in my opinion, when it comes to the kind of love story. They get a little bit too adorable, a little bit too invested, whereas I could never really get that invested knowing the reality of the situation. So, 6 out of 10. Let me know your thoughts, your opinions. If you think this is greater than I think, then comment down below. Tell me all the things you liked about it, all the things you didn't like about it, how you feel about it. I'm very curious to hear your opinions. I think this is a pretty good movie when it comes down to it. But for me, it is just on the other side of average. Not anything extraordinary or, just, I don't know how to frame that particularly, but it's a good movie, but not a great one. Big good one here. Eventually we will like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff.